Greetings, gamers! This is a huge week for the Call of Duty League because the Seattle Surge are hosting the final home series of the season. After this, all we have left is the Stage 5 Major and of course the tournament we've all been waiting for, CoD Champs, back on land. But do you know what else that means? It means the Fantasy Call of Duty season is sadly coming to a close. So what I want to do for today's video is show you guys how I put together my Draft Royale team. This is inside information for all my strategies, tips, and tricks, and don't worry, this is going to become a regular segment on the channel for years to come. So without further ado, let's hop right into it and let me show you how to draft the best team in Fantasy CoD. So the first thing that I factor in to putting together my fantasy roster for the week is strength of schedule. I want to play the best matchups for certain players. So when I look at the Seattle Surge home series, a few teams pop out for me that I have to have players from their roster. The first one is Optic Chicago. I love that matchup on Thursday against the London Royal Ravens. I think you can expect big numbers from pretty much everybody on this Optic Chicago roster. Apart from this, when you look forward to the matchup that OG has on Saturday against the LA Thieves, I think for how hot Optic has looked lately, that's another good matchup for them. So I'm tuning myself in and circling players on the Optic roster, and at this point, just deciding who I want based on what else I pick around the team. Another good matchup that I like for the week is the Minnesota Rocker and Florida Mutineers. I really think this is a good matchup for both teams because I can see it being a tight series, which usually results in a couple of search and destroy matches, possibly a map 5, and your players can accumulate points and have a big week for the team. I think anyone from the Minnesota Rocker here and anyone from the Florida Mutineers is a good pick. The final matchup that I want to highlight that I am green-lighting all week long is the Atlanta FaZe versus the New York Subliners. The Subliners have struggled all of Stage 5 and have not won a single series. On top of this, Clay has taken time away, which means DiamondCon is back in the roster for New York. I think the Atlanta FaZe will run all over the New York Subliners this week. So that high-priced player that we're looking for, I think they come from the Atlanta FaZe this week. After we look at the matchups, the first thing I always do to begin building my Draft Royale team is buying my high-value player. This is your guy who's going to cost the most money. Your budget is $360 for the week. This is the player that I'm willing to spend up to about $90 on. Typically, that player comes from the Atlanta FaZe. This year, we've also seen Standy and Shotzzy in that high category, but I already know the combination of this player and their success all season long, and then the matchups that they have, he is coming from the Atlanta FaZe. This player that I'm talking about is Simp. If you look at what he's done on the season, he's coming off an 89-point week. He has had 6 straight weeks with at least 80 points, including a 100-point week there, and then back to Major 4. He was performing out of his mind. So Simp is a must-have on my roster for this week. Playing against the New York Subliners, that's an automatic lock. So I've spent $90. That brings me down to $270 with an average of $54 remaining for the budget of my roster. What I want to do next is build another player who is going to be the core and the backbone of my team, and I'm okay spending a higher dollar amount on this guy, and then from there what I'll do is play high upside players, which means picking guys who they have a good floor where their worst performance, it's still going to be decent, but they have the chance to pop off. That's a great strategy I love to implement, so let's nail in our next player who will be a core part of our roster, because a combination of matchups and best players is what you want, but you always take talent. I relate this to fantasy football. Even though Christian McCaffrey plays on the Panthers and they're not that great of a team, you're going to take talent every single week. This player happens to be on a talented team, and he's a great player. My AR for the week, and one of those matchups that I loved for Optic Chicago, I'm picking Dashy. You look at his stats over the previous weeks, he comes at a lower value because he only scored 64 points last week, but look at what else he can do. Back-to-back weeks in the 80s and a high 70 number. I think that's a good player to have on your roster, which is why Dashy is my next pick. So now I've filled out the first two players of my roster, the AR and the SMG. I only have an average price remaining of about $50 and a total budget of $202. So now it's time to start getting into the nitty gritty. This is where for our utility players, we are playing the value and the high upside. The ability to pop off basically is what I'm looking for based off their matchup and the player they are all season long. So this, I'm going to look into another matchup that I mentioned with the Minnesota Rocker and Florida Mutineers, and I'm taking a flex utility player who has been there all season long, and he has never really cost that much, so I know that I can get him for a good value. That guy that I'm looking at is Priesta. He only cost $63 this week. He had 73 points last week and the week prior, and when you look down at him previously, he can always have performances like he did in week 11, where he'll touch the high 80s and even 90s like he did back in week 9, which I think makes Preston Griner an absolute hammer for my roster. I am selecting Priesta for my first utility slot this week, and that leaves me with a budget of $139. So what I have to do now is really play low value players who I think are going to be incredible. What you can do here, you can start a plug and play to see what you like and how much you have remaining and kind of go back and forth, and you can add a couple players, delete a couple players to get your best roster. The next player that I'm going to take is someone who has a good matchup because they play the New York Subliners this week. I'm looking down for Paris Legion and a guy who's an incredible player. He has a lot of passion, and he's been good for fantasy in previous weeks. Scraps is the guy I'm talking about. He's coming off a huge week. Even though his team has been terrible all season long, that doesn't mean that he's necessarily a bad fantasy player. This goes back to looking at Christian McCaffrey on the Panthers. You take talent when talent is there. Scraps coming off an 82-point week. Prior to that, he had a couple struggling ones, but week 12, he almost popped off for a 100-point week. You know the upside is there, and that's something that I preach. It's something I've talked about already. Matty Marshall has upside. He'll always give it his best. He's going to play hard. That's why I'm adding Scraps to my roster for this week. He's one of my big budget players who I have to have, so let's get him on the roster and then continue to pick. I love that pick with Scraps, and that leaves us with $85 to distribute between our team and player. So at this point, I'm going to look at the team and try and get a good budget team who I think has the opportunity to win and put up some good stats. So I start at the bottom. I look at all these teams. I don't like the LA Thieves against Optic Chicago. I don't like the LA Gorillas ever. The Royal Ravens played well last week, but they face Optic. I don't like that matchup. Paris could be good against NYSL, but another matchup they have kind of scares me away. So I go up towards this budget of about 41, and I highlight the Minnesota Rocker. We just took Priesta early for one of our utility slots, so I'm adding the Minnesota Rocker to kind of double my team with Priesta, and that's a good combination for success. So now what we have to do is look into previous weeks. We have $44 remaining. That's all we can do. We're looking for a player who can come cheap but perform well for our team, and I look at someone who shined last week, who nobody anticipated playing this well, and I think he can do it again this week. I go down and I look at the London Royal Ravens. Alex had an absolutely phenomenal week last week, and he comes at a great value for your team of $43. He put together a good performance, a 100-point week, so I think that he's a good player who can have another good week despite him having tough goes in the past with a 27-point week and a 51-point week. He has not been anything great, so I think him coming off that 100-point week will give him confidence, have the ability to pop off, and that's why to round out my roster, I am going with Alex from the London Royal Ravens. You may think that's a tough pick going with Alex, but you look at the second matchup, the Royal Ravens play Paris. I like two of my guys in that matchup. I have Scraps and Alex going head-to-head, and I think that those are good budget picks for the week, and that's something to build your team around. So now we have our entire roster for the week comprised, and I think we put together a good one. Those low dollar, high value, and high upside players really did it for me, and I'm excited to see what they can do in this week's matches. Let's go through a recap of how we got through all this, and this is the roster that we built. First pick, we went with Simp. That's our high dollar player that you want to build as the core of your team. He's always going to be great. He's always going to perform, and they have a great matchup against the New York Subliners this week. week. Apart from that, another decent dollar player in Dashy. I love him in the AR slot. I think that Optic has great matchups this week against the London Royal Ravens and the LA Thieves. I look for him to perform. Optic has been on a roll, and I think they'll continue this week. After this, our first utility pick was Priesta. This was mainly based off of his upside and the matchup of a good series in the making against the Florida Mutineers. I don't think you can go wrong with Priesta. He's been great all season long. He steps into the flex role incredibly well. Watch out for him to perform big. From there, we went with Scraps as our other utility. We had to start bringing the budget down a little bit. I know Scraps is an incredible player. He has a lot of passion and a lot of great upside and potential every single week. Love the matchup for him against NYSL and then again against the London Royal Ravens. Expect great things from Scraps this week. My final utility player is Alex. This is based strictly off hindsight. Last week, with him scoring 100 points, I needed a low dollar player. Him coming in at $43, it was an automatic slam. I had to pick Alex. Rounding out the team now, we had to pick the final slot in our roster, and that is the team. We went with the Minnesota Rocker. They have a matchup against the Florida Mutineers this week. I think they can perform well. They're fighting for seeding in the champ bracket and also the Stage 5 Major, so I think they're going to be inspired, and I think that they will play well. Look at this team. This is a great team. I think they're going to work wonders this week. So that's the roster for this week, guys. Come back to the channel every single week for more insight, tips, tricks, and strategies on how to put together the best draft royale team in Fantasy Call of Duty. This is something that I'm going to make a regular segment, and I'm transitioning the YouTube channel to be fantasy-centered. I'm going to hit you guys in the off-season with player rankings, draft kits for the upcoming season, and all sorts of strategies. So if you want to become the best Fantasy Call of Duty player, stay tuned, subscribe, like, and comment. Send me pictures on Twitter at zhack16 of your guys' teams for the week. I'm interested to see what you put together. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Peace.